Okay, I always like to bring up, before we start the lesson, the latest from the Chisholm Trail Shopper, Chisholm Trail News. This is the one you got in your mailbox today if you live in Stevens County. This is called Break It To Me Gently. A traveling salesman really loved his cat, Puff. While on the road, he called home. "How's Puff?" he asked his wife. His wife said, "Puff is dead." The man broke down and cried. "How could you be so insensitive?" He sobbed to his wife. "Couldn't you somehow have prepared me for Puff's death?" "How?" asked his wife. "Well, first you could have told me that Puff was up on the roof and couldn't get down. He fell off and hurt himself. Then the next week when I called home, you could have said Puff wasn't doing well. And the next week when I called, you could have told me the veterinarian had to put him down. So you could have kind of prepared me for this." Anyway, so a week later, the salesman calls home and says, "Well, how are things going at home?" His wife replied, "Well, your mother's on the roof and I can't get her down." Anyway, that's why you should read your Chisholm Trail Shopper. There's good stuff in there. Okay, break it to me gently. Okay, Ezra, we're in the fourth lesson on our series on the book of Ezra. And we always do a quick review for those of you who have not been here the previous lessons. We've actually covered 4 of the chapters in our 3 lessons. So as the book begins, the Jews have just completed they've been in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And these are the Jews from Judah and Benjamin, what was the southern kingdom, the 2 southern tribes. The 10 northern tribes had been taken into captivity by Assyria 100 years before that, and basically were scattered and are now considered the lost tribes. So anybody that's a Jew today basically is from the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, because the lost tribes basically lost their ancestry. Anyway, so as Ezra begins, the king of Persia, whose name is Cyrus, he makes a proclamation that any Jew that wants to, that's in Babylon, they're in captivity, but they're not really in prison. They're living in Babylon as, I guess you call it, exiles. So they're living there. So he makes a proclamation that any Jew that's living in Babylon that wants to go back to Jerusalem and Judah and help rebuild the temple can do that. And what we believe from the Jewish historian Josephus writes that Daniel, and one reason I chose this book to study was because Pastor just finished a series on Daniel in here. And Daniel, as you know, was one of the captives of Jews that went to Babylon, and he rose through the ranks and basically became an advisor to a series of the Babylonian kings. And so Josephus tells us in his history that as soon as Cyrus became king, Daniel, his advisor, basically showed him the prophecies from Isaiah and Jeremiah that Pastor showed us when we were studying Daniel, that 100 to 200 years before Cyrus became king, Isaiah and Jeremiah both name Cyrus by name as God's vessel that he's going to use to free his captives. So this is even before they went into captivity. This is a prophecy of what the future was. And so Josephus tells us that Cyrus was so impressed by those writings and those prophecies from 100 to 200 years ago that he did exactly what God wanted him to, which was allow the Jews to come back. Nebuchadnezzar, before the 70-year captivity, had taken them captive out of Jerusalem and Judah and Benjamin and destroyed the temple. So they're going back. The proclamation was that you can return, but we want you to restore the temple and restore worship to your God. We studied last time how the thinking in that time that most people had, especially the pagans had, was that each land had its own God. And so basically King Cyrus is saying, go back and restore the temple to your God, that's the God of your land. And that was kind of the thinking. So as you read through these books, you'll kind of see the God of Israel, or your God, to other words, that's your guy, not my guy. So Cyrus wasn't necessarily a believer in God, but he was impressed that God had actually had prophecies about him. Anyway, so his decree was three things. Number one, that you could, if you want to go back and do so, you can. Number two, Nebuchadnezzar had stolen about 5,400 gold and silver objects out of the temple before he destroyed it, and had those in storage apparently, and Cyrus gave those back to the Jews to take back with them. And then the third part of the decree that we read in Ezra chapter 1 was that he commanded the Jews' neighbors in Babylon to gift them, to give them silver and gold and clothes and costly wares, anything that they might need for the journey, and also, to live, to begin their life again, because much of what was in Judah had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So the Jewish historians refer to this as the second Exodus. Obviously, the first Exodus was when Moses led them out of Egypt, which was 1,000 or so years earlier. And so now they're calling this the second Exodus, because just like the first Exodus, the people of the land gift them as they leave. And so we know that that's what happened in Moses' time also. Then we went to chapter 2. And chapter 2, we didn't really read all that because it's basically a list of the different clans of the Jews that decided to go back. If you add all those up, it adds about 50,000 Jews, which seems like a lot. I mean, that's more than people that live in Stevens County, but really, if you think back to the height of the Jewish nation back in David and Solomon's time, there were probably 2 or 3 million. So this is truly what we would call a remnant. We know that many of them stayed in Babylon. We know that many of them were killed during the Nebuchadnezzar's siege and battles. And so about 50,000 decide to come back, and they come back to Jerusalem. And I don't think I've mentioned, but that's a 1,700-mile journey. So that's halfway across the United States. And they also list in chapter 2 the animals that were given to them to come back, and they were basically farm animals. There were certainly not enough animals for them to get on and ride. So basically, most of them walked. So think about walking 1,700 miles. So you're talking about a 4 or 5, 6 month journey, depending on how far you can go each day. So it was no small thing to go back to home. Okay, then in chapter 3, we saw how they restored worship at the site of the altar. In other words, they could see where the altar had been torn down, where the base of the altar had been, where the temple had been torn down. And so before they even start rebuilding, they restore worship. So at this point, they have their priorities straight. And they realize that worship is more important than building a building. And then that kind of reminded us of the saying that the prophet Samuel told Saul when King Saul disobeyed, that to obey is better than to sacrifice. In other words, God wants our obedience more than he wants outward shows of worship. And so it's more important. God is saying, if I'm not obeying God in my daily life, just showing up at church doesn't really, get me a bunch of brownie points. In other words, a lot of people kind of have that in their mind. They can live like they want to, as long as they show up at church every once in a while. Well, God says to obey is better than to sacrifice. In other words, to live my life, to obey my words, to obey my commandments is much more important than just showing up for a worship service. Okay, chapter 4. So they've started the rebuilding. They've just kind of barely started the rebuilding, and they encourage some pushback from the locals. So who are these locals? They're called Samaritans, but basically after the Jews were taken captive, especially the northern Jews were taken captive, the Assyrians repopulated northern Israel, and then after Babylon took the southern kingdom captive, there was some repopulation of the southern kingdom. So these foreigners who had been captured from other countries were put back into the Israel area, and so they were living there. So they've been there 70 years while most of the Jews were gone. Now we do believe that there were, some of the rural Jews that stayed. It was mainly the cities, all the Jews that were congregated in cities that were taken captive. And so that's why even in Jesus' time, the Jews considered Samaritans half-breeds because their ancestors were from foreign countries who had been repopulated, and they intermarried with the Jews that were kind of still living there out in the country. Anyway, so they're living there, and now these Jews come back, and so the locals don't really think it's a good idea for them to kind of come back because it's like they're trying to take over again. So they are threatened. So chapter 4 starts off saying they discourage the Jews. Now, this is not a one-time thing. It says they discourage them. It says they bribe lawyers to frustrate them and write letters to the king of Persia over a period of about 20 years. So for 20 years they had opposition to rebuilding the temple. And chapter 4 even gives one of those letters, and it's full of a lot of lies and slander that basically tells the king that, hey, if you let these Jews do this, now by this time Cyrus is no longer king. There's another king. So they're writing to these subsequent kings and saying, if you let the Jews do this, then they're going to rebel. If you'll just look back in the history books of our nation, you'll see that these Jews are rebellious people. They're not going to pay taxes like they're supposed to. And so all of these accusations. And so the king at that time was Artaxerxes. And so we pointed out at the last lesson that he showed his very poor leadership ability because after hearing one side of the story, he makes a decree. And we talked about how, anybody in a person of authority, whether you're a parent, whether you're an employer, whether you're a pastor, whether you're even a bunch of friends, basically if somebody comes to you and says, I have this complaint against so-and-so, you don't make a decision based on hearing one side. You should always hear both sides. That's called having a judicial temperament. When you go to court, you expect the judge to hear both sides, not just hear one side and make a decision. So Artaxerxes doesn't call the Jews up to give their side of the story. He makes a decision after hearing one side and says, okay, if this is what's going to happen, then these Jews have got to stop rebuilding. So he actually makes a decree, has it sent back down to Judea, saying you've got to stop building. So the Jews give in. It's easier to give in than to go back and appeal the decision. So that's what they do. Okay, so we ended last time with chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. So after 20 years of discouragement, we found that the way they overcame discouragement was they changed their influencers. They had let these locals, these folks that were living there that didn't really belong, influence them and discourage them for 20 years. And so they finally ended the discouragement when they changed their influencers. So when we get discouraged, we need to do the same thing. You need to look at who are you being influenced by. If you're feeling discouraged, are you getting influenced by the thoughts and the people and the lifestyle of the world, or are you getting your influence from the Word of God and the people of God? Okay, we'll start reading now at chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, which is where we stopped last time. So there were two prophets that came back with the Israelites from Babylon to Judah. They were named Haggai and Zechariah. They each have books in the Old Testament. They're called minor prophets, not because they were lesser of importance, but because minor simply, there's 5 major prophets and 12 minor prophets. The major ones basically are longer books. The minor ones are generally very short books. So that's why they're called minor prophets. Okay, so now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, who is a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel, who was over them. And then we've talked about the two leaders that came back with the Jews, Zerubbabel, who was the political leader, and then Joshua, not the same Joshua that followed Moses, but this is a different, Joshua, just a common name, kind of like David or whatever. Anyway, but Joshua was the high priest. So verse 2, then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Zozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. So basically, this is when the Jews changed their influencers and started listening to God, and Haggai had returned from Babylon with the 50,000 Jews. Now, we have no idea. We don't know a lot about Haggai. We don't have any idea if he was born from a Jewish family while they were in Babylon. We don't know if he was born back before the captivity, but now remember, you've got 70 years captivity, and we're now, depending on which commentator you read, 16 to 20 years later at this point. So if he was born back in Judea earlier, he had to be really, really old right now. But anyway, we do know that he is a prophet sent by God to the Jews. So Haggai comes to encourage and teach and prophesy, and so we're gonna look at what he has to say. I thought that would be interesting. So we're going to turn over to the book of Haggai, and again, I've got it on your lesson sheet, but you're certainly welcome to turn to that. But what is it? I wanted to know, what is it that he said that got them out of this funk and got them back to doing what God wanted them to and doing the mission that they were sent to do, which was rebuild the temple? So the book of Haggai is very short. It's like 38 verses, and we're not going to read all of those, but basically it tells us what he told them to kind of get them to straighten up. So we're going to go through that tonight. So let's start in Haggai verse 1. In the second year of King Darius, so Darius, now this is not the same Darius as the one in the time of Daniel. This is a different Darius. This Darius followed the Artaxerxes that the letter was written to back in chapter 4. In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, the political leader, and governor of Judah, and to Joshua, who's the high priest. And so verse 2, this is what the Lord Almighty says. So Haggai is speaking as a prophet from God. These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. So Haggai begins his message to the people by quoting a popular expression that he's been hearing from these people. And what he's hearing is when he goes around and asking, why aren't you rebuilding the temple? They're all telling him, well, it's just not time yet. It's just not time yet. Of course, that's not the real reason. The real reason is that, they've been afraid of the locals and afraid of the edict of the king, and they've been discouraged. But they're telling Haggai it's just not time yet. And so they had given in to their neighbors. They didn't make an appeal to Artaxerxes like they could have. And so basically they had become indifferent to the mission that they had, which was to rebuild the temple. And then, kind of interesting, notice how, as Haggai is speaking the words, the Lord's words, says, these people say. It kind of remind me of, you have an angry wife that refers to her husband. She doesn't say my husband, she says this man. And so here God is talking to his people, the Jews, and he's saying these people. He's not saying my people. He's saying these people. He's not happy with them. Not happy with them at all. Thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, now let's look at verses 3 and 4. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house, in other words, the temple, remains a ruin? So Haggai's saying, you say it's not time to rebuild God's house, but look what you've done for yourselves. So you've made some really nice houses for yourself during this 20 years that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. He talks about paneled houses. You remember paneling? I can remember. I'm old enough to remember when paneling was all the rage, especially the den in your house. Back in the 60s and 70s, and I'm sure some of those homes still today. And so that's a beautiful wooded paneling. I remember those. House I grew up in that had that. Anyway, so what he's talking about is basically the same thing here. That back then they used cedar wood because their houses were pretty much stone houses. But the nicer houses, they would get cedar logs and cut them into boards and kind of line the walls. Of course, you've been in the cedar closet before. You know how good that smells. And also it kind of helps prevent disease and stuff. And so basically they had lined the walls of their houses with cedar logs, cedar boards. And you have to ask yourself, now where did they get all this cedar from? Or do you remember what happened about 20 years ago in this story? When Cyrus made the decree, part of the agreement was that they could get cedars from Lebanon. Lebanon is north of Jerusalem, north of Judea. And so those are incredible trees. They're mentioned, I forget, 20 or 30 times in the Bible, the cedars of Lebanon. But they're trees that are 70 to 130 feet tall. They're just massive, massive cedar trees. And cedar is a wood that's very resistant to rot and disease and decay. And so basically they had commissioned for cedar logs to be brought down from the Lebanon area, put on a boat, brought down from Tyre in Lebanon to Joppa, which is 40 miles from Jerusalem, and then hauled overland to Jerusalem. So they had all this cedar, and it took them about 7 months to do it, to get all this cedar ready for the temple of God. Now, we don't know for sure if that's where they got the cedar for their houses, but the cedar's sitting there and they've paneled their houses. And I kind of think that's one reason that God is upset with them, because they've taken what was meant for his temple, and because they were discouraged by all the neighbors and the locals, they thought, well, we'll just use this for our houses. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's what's happened, but we don't know for sure. But I certainly wouldn't be surprised. Okay, so verses 5 and 6. Okay, this is Haggai continuing his speeches to the Jews. Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Consider your ways. You have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm, and he who earned wages does so to put them in a bag with holes. And so Haggai is saying, this is his primary message to them in this whole book of Haggai, is consider your ways. Stop and think about what you're doing, Jews. You have been sent here, you agreed, you volunteered to come from Babylon, to come back and build the house of God, and you let outsiders who have nothing to do with this discourage you from doing this. You didn't appeal to Artaxerxes when he wrote a decree for you to stop, and so you've just kind of quit doing what you were supposed to be doing, and you're focused on making life for yourself comfortable and doing as much. Your mission was to rebuild the temple, but you haven't done that, and so as a result, he's saying God has brought you famine and drought. And so he said, you've sown, but you've harvested little. You eat, but you never get enough. You drink, but you're never full. You put on clothes, but you're never warm enough. So he's saying, because you're following your own plans and not God's plan, God is disciplining you again. That was the reason he sent them into captivity for 7 years, because they had not been following his commands and his word. So Haggai is saying, have you thought about why you're kind of having a hard time here now? God is disciplining you again because you're not, following his priorities. You're following your own priorities. Okay, verse 7 and 8. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. He repeats it. Consider your ways. Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house, that I may take pleasure in it, that I may be glorified, says the Lord. So you see, they got the cedar 20 years ago, but now they're having to go cut some more wood. So that's kind of where I got the idea that they'd used all the cedar up in their houses. So again, he says, consider your ways. Stop focusing on yourselves and do what God has brought you back here to do and rebuild his temple. Okay, verse 9. You looked for much, and behold, it came to little. When you brought it home, I blew it away. I love that. In other words, God's talking to them. He said, when you brought things home for yourselves, I blew them away. Why, declares the Lord of hosts? Because of my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies himself with his own house. So Haggai is saying, again, you forgot your mission. All your attention is on your personal wealth, your personal comfort, making life good for yourself. You're not doing anything for the mission of God, for God's plans and God's word. And so when you are trying to build up wealth for yourself, you're finding that it's difficult, because as soon as you bring it in, God blows it away. Interesting, huh? So God is disciplining them again. Verse 10 and 11. Therefore the heavens above, Therefore the heavens above you have withheld the dew, the earth has withheld its produce, and I have called for a drought on the land and the hills, on the grain, the new wine, the oil, on what the ground brings forth, on man and beast, and all their labors. So God's telling them through Haggai, I'm the one that has brought you this drought and famine. You can blame me, but I'm doing it because I'm disciplining you because you're not doing what I've told you to do. In other words, you're following your priorities, not mine. So this disobedience of yours has brought economic catastrophe, and so you have brought this on yourselves. So don't blame anybody but yourselves for what's happening. Okay, let's look at verse 12 through 15. So we see now the result of his message. Okay, this is the result. So it works. It wakes them up. Then Zerubbabel, the political leader, and Joshua, the high priest, with all the remnant of the people, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent him. And the people feared the Lord. That's showing that they've turned their hearts, their desires back to God. Then Haggai, the messenger of the Lord, spoke to the people with the Lord's message, I am with you, declared the Lord. So God is saying, yes, I'm disciplining you. I'm making things hard on you because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, but I haven't left you. I haven't forsaken you. I'm still with you. I just want you to do what you're supposed to do. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people, and they came and they worked on the house of the Lord of God, their host, on the 24th day of the month, in the 6th month, in the 2nd year of Darius the king. So Haggai's words from God did get the Jews back to rebuilding the temple. Okay, let's see here. So now that's the message from Haggai. So now let's go back to Ezra, and we'll kind of take up the story there, okay? So that's the background on what Haggai told them in verse 1 and 2, where it says Haggai and Zechariah spoke to them. You can also read the book of Zechariah. It's quite a bit longer. Haggai is just 38 verses. Zechariah is 8 or 10 chapters, and it's some of the history like we read tonight, but a lot of it is prophecy also. But you're certainly welcome to read that and see what Zechariah told them at the same time. Okay, so let's Haggai's gotten them back on track. So after 16 to 20 years of being discouraged, they've changed their influencers. They're listening to the right influencers, listening to the prophets of God. So let's go back to Ezra chapter 5. Now, here's the question for you. So they're back on track. They're doing what they want to. Do you think the locals are happy? You know, for 20 years, the locals have had their way. They've kept them discouraged. And so now the Jews are back on track. They're back to building the temple. So what do you think? Do you think this makes them happy? Well, let's read verse 3 to 5 on Ezra 5. At the same time, Tattenai, he's the provincial governor of the area, and they call this province the Beyond the River province. The governor and then another guy, I can't pronounce his name, and their associates came to them and spoke to them and said, so they're coming to the Jews, who gave you a decree that you could rebuild this house, rebuild this temple, and finish this structure? They also said, what are the names of the men who are building this building? Then it says, but the eye of their God. So God is protecting his people because they're doing what he says they should do. But the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they, meaning the governor and his people, did not stop them until the report should reach Darius, and then an answer be returned by letter concerning it. And so what's happening is they start rebuilding, and so obviously the locals go to their governor and say, hey, these guys are doing what they're not supposed to. You know, we got this letter from Artaxerxes saying they're not supposed to build, and so all of a sudden, here we go again, you know, and the opposition rises up again. And so the governor comes and says, okay, you know, I'm taking names, give me the names of all the guys building this, why are you doing this? But then it says the eye of God was on his people. And so what happens is this time, the governor says, okay, I'm going to send a message to the king, who is now Darius, another king past Artaxerxes, and ask him if it's okay for you to do this, but in the meantime, you can keep working. So God influenced the governor, kind of like he influenced Cyrus, again, not pagan people, but he influenced the governor to be generous enough to let the Jews continue doing what they were doing while he got an answer back from the king. So apparently the Jews told, we're not going to read verse 6 through 17, that's not on your list sheet, but it's basically the letter that the governor writes to King Darius. And what he says in that letter is, he said, King Darius, I want you to know that the Jews that have repopulated down here are starting to rebuild this temple again like they did 20 years ago. And they tell me that when they were sent down here by King Cyrus, they were given the mission to rebuild the temple, and that, you know, they given all these gold and silver objects from Solomon's temple to put back in the new temple, and that they were given gifts from their neighbors to bring down here. And so I need to know if this is true. If this is true, let me know. If it's not true, let me know, and I'll stop it. But so the governor is asking King Darius, should I let this continue or should I not? Is this story the Jews are telling me true or not? So he's saying, search your royal archives. You know, we'd call it a library or a Hall of Congress or something like that. You know, search the royal records and see if you can find where Cyrus, 20 years ago said they could do this. Okay, that brings us down to chapter 6. So that'll be on the next page, or the back of your lesson. Ezra 6, 1 through 2. King Darius, so he receives this letter from Tattenai, the governor. King Darius then issued an order, and they searched in the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon. Obviously, they didn't find it there, because verse 2 says, a scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media. That is 300 miles from Babylon. That was the summer palace of the Babylonian kings, history tells us. And so apparently, maybe when Cyrus wrote his decree, he was at the summer home. But, I mean, that's how extensively they searched to get Tattenai, the governor, his answer, that they've actually found a scroll that was dictated by Cyrus to his scribes from 20 years previously that was being stored in the archives at the king's summer home. Okay, verse 3 through 5, chapter 6. So in the first year of King Cyrus, okay, so this is what the scroll said. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. It is to be 60 cubits, a cubit's about 18 inches, about 1.5 feet. So 60 cubits high, so that's about 90 feet high, so we're talking about 9 stories high. Pastors told me it's 44 feet up there, so we're talking about twice as high as that. 60 cubits wide, so the same width, and with 3 courses of large stones and 1 of timbers. The cost, I've got this underlined, the cost are be paid by the royal treasury. Also the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are to be returned to their places in the temple in Jerusalem. They are to be deposited in the house of God. So this is all Cyrus's original written decree from 20 years ago. So in the written decree, notice it didn't say that in chapter 1 when we were talking about what Cyrus decreed. Somehow that got lost in the translation. But the written decree says, not only do I send you back to rebuild the temple, I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to pay for all your expenses. This is an all expenses paid trip and mission. Verse 6 through 10. Now then Tattenai, the governor of Trans-Euphrates, across the river province, and the other officials of that province, stay away from there. So this is Darius adding to what Cyrus, in other words, he copies off what Cyrus wrote 20 years ago. Now Darius, the present king, adds his current comments to send back to Tattenai. He says, "Now then, Tattenai, you and all your other officials, stay away from there. Leave the Jews alone. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I hereby decree that what you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of the house of God, their expenses are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury, from the revenues of the Trans-Euphrates, in other words, from the revenues of that province. So the taxes that Tattenai collects from all the Samaritans are going to be used to be paid to build the temple. Isn't that great? Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil, as requested by the priest in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons." So, in other words, as long as they're praying for me, I'm happy. But we're going to pay for all this. So that's pretty amazing, because that really wasn't made clear in Cyrus's original decree that the king and his king's treasury was going to pay for all of that, all the expenses. Okay, let's go to verse 11 and 12. Also, this is great. I mean, Darius is really getting with it here. "I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam will be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled on it." Pretty serious, huh? That's what you call making an example out of somebody. So any of you Samaritans want to speak up against this project? Speak up. We'll make you the first example. "And his house shall be made a dunghill." So they'll start basically turn their house into a manure pile. "May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put a hand out to alter this, or to destroy this house of God that is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree, let it be done with all diligence." Wow. And we end up with verse 14 through 16. "So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of God of Israel and the decree of Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th month of the reign of King Darius. Then the people, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy." So when they changed their influencers, they started listening to the voices they should be listening to. They got out of their funk, they got out of their discouragement, and they started doing what God wanted them to do. So that's a good lesson for us. Good lesson for us. Anyway, so I was amazed what Darius wrote back, how complete he made that answer to stop the total opposition. So finally, the temple has been rebuilt. The Jews have a dedication ceremony. And so let's look at the lessons we can from the study tonight. Number one, we must consider our ways. So Haggai said that 2 times. There's a famous saying, and I looked back to see who said it. The saying is, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Have you ever heard that before? The unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, if all you do in life is you get up, you eat, you go to work, you play, you drink, you watch TV, go to bed, you redial it, repeat. Just your entire life is just a circle of just going through the motions. At the end of your life, you look back and what you've done. You've just gone through the motions for your whole life. So what is really there that's made your life worthwhile? And so that's what this man said, that the unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, you really need to stop and think about your life. Think about your priorities. Think about who you're serving. Think about what you're doing. Think about who you represent. Think about what people see when they see you and what they hear when they hear you, rather than just kind of meandering through life and living and then dying. The man that said this was Socrates. Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher, and he was actually put on trial and sentenced to death, but that was part of his, I guess you'd say, his defense. He was a philosopher. But the unexamined life is not worth living. So basically, that's what Haggai is telling the Jews, and I would say telling us, consider your ways, examine your life, and see if it's really what it needs to be. So the Jews had been released by Cyrus for one reason, that was to go back and to rebuild the temple of God. That was their mission. But as soon as the opposition rose up, as soon as they had a little difficulty, they just sat down. And they started focusing on their own comfort, making their paneled houses, trying to build their own wealth. Of course, God made that hard on them because he was not happy with them, because they were there to rebuild his house, and he wanted his house rebuilt first. So they were more concerned with their comfort, and they were concerned with avoiding conflict. So God brought drought and famine on them, and then he brings Haggai to them saying, consider your ways. And he's still telling us that today, that God wants us to focus our lives on his priorities. If we're calling ourselves Christians, if we're following after his way, then our life should look something like Jesus' life. Our life should look something like what is displayed in the Scriptures as far as how God would want us to live. And so the perspectives and the priorities of the world are not God's perspective and priorities. It's so easy, and there's just so much stuff that comes into our head, so easy for the world's priorities to kind of creep into our head, into our life, and so we become more like the world than we should be. We need to be unique people. We need to be people that are obviously from a different world and belong to a different world. So we must consider our ways. Romans 12, 1 through 2 says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed. And how you do that is you renew your mind. So being transformed from this world to God's way starts in our head. Then our bodies will follow. So it's how we think. And so that goes back to that saying, consider your ways. The unexamined life is not worth living. God's saying, renew your mind. Don't be conformed to the world. Be different. Don't be afraid to be different. Okay, the second lesson is God can use setbacks to get our attention. So in our lesson tonight, the remnant of the Jews had returned to Judah, and they were to restore worship and rebuild the temple, but they got off task. They got off track. They quit doing God's work, and they started focusing on working for their own comfort because it was much easier, there was less opposition, and they could kind of do what they wanted to. They were pursuing their own goals. You know, the irony is that when they stopped pursuing God's focus and God's ways, they started chasing after their own goals. They found they couldn't meet those things. Of course, a lot of that was God's doing. But, they thought, if I just spend all my time working for my comfort and my good, I'll be good to go, and man, I'll get wealthy. God made sure they didn't, because that was not what he wanted them to do. So the irony is that the more they put in their own pockets, the less they had. I love that saying in Haggai, you're finding yourself you're putting money in your pockets, and your pockets have holes in them. Ever done that when you're a kid? I remember having, putting money in my pocket when I was a kid, and I reaching there to get it, and it's not there anymore because it slipped out. The hole in the pocket, right. And so, but that picture can be like our lives if we spend all our time and energy and focus on trying to do selfish things and trying to make things better for ourselves, not on spiritual things. We think that all this energy will really make us happier, and yet we find that we're never really happy, never really joyful, because the world doesn't really give joy and happiness in the way the Lord does. So you can spend a lot of time and energy, but you'll find it's kind of like having pockets with holes in them. There's not really a lot there. It's kind of an empty life. So in this story here, we see that God used setbacks to get their attention. In other words, he brought the famine, he brought the drought, and he had to get their attention to show them that they were not doing the thing they should be doing. He wanted them to consider their ways, but until they got into a crisis, they really weren't going to listen. And so today he wants us to follow his priorities and not ours. Okay, the third lesson, God can make the opposition work in his favor. So because of the continued opposition, the 20 years of opposition, that forced a search for Cyrus's original decree. Because Darius said, okay, I want to find out what this really, if this was said, and if it said, what did it say, so I can make a proper judgment on this. But you see, until that, we brought out that in chapter 1, Cyrus, all it lists is 3 things. You can go back if you want to. Number 2, go back and rebuild the temple. And number 3, I'll give you the things that belonged in the temple that Nebuchadnezzar got, and then also all your neighbors are supposed to give you stuff. There's nothing in that original decree that we know in Ezra chapter 1 that the government's going to pay for all this. But because the opposition just kept on and kept on and kept on and kept on, basically that worked in the favor of the people of God, because it forced Darius to find that edict from Cyrus, and they read it, and it said it's all going to be paid for by the government. So God used opposition to work in his favor, because it's not like the Jews had all this extra wealth that they had taken down there with them. So in that way, God made opposition work in his favor, and he can do that in our lives. We have every one of us has to live in the human condition on this earth. Nobody here has a perfect life. You may look at somebody and think their life's perfect. I assure you it's not. Everybody has troubles in their life. Everybody has setbacks. We all have failures. We all have tragedies. We all have disappointments. We all have defeats. But there's not one of those that God can't use to bless us. God can use the opposition to come to be a blessing for you. It's kind of like when Jesus died on the cross. Satan thought he'd won, right? Satan thought, I'm the opposition, and I have won. Jesus has died. Well, that wasn't a setback for God. That was part of the plan. So Jesus dying on the cross was not a setback for God and his people. It wasn't a failure. It wasn't a defeat. God used what appeared to be a defeat for absolute victory. And so God today can use opposition in your life to bring out his favor on your life. And it may not see it immediately. Here in this story here, it took 20 years. 20 years of opposition for God to allow that opposition for 20 years to occur, until the great benefit of this tremendous amount of money from the treasury to support the Jews, not just the rebuilding the temple, but to pay them, bring all these sacrifices for them to sacrifice, brought all the animals for them to sacrifice. It's just amazing. But God used that opposition in his favor. So God can turn any opposition in your life to your favor. So don't let that get you down. Just, you say, often, I was talking to a guy in the clinic the other day, and he'd had a rough time with his health, really, really bad time with his health. He said, I went to church as a kid, and he said, I really hadn't gone to church in 20 or 30 years, but, I just have a hard time with belief, because I just can't believe a loving God would, let me be in this physical condition. So we had to talk about that for a while. But we're all in the human condition. That's not God's ultimate good for you is the salvation of your soul. You know, and yes, we want God's favor on our physical bodies too, but let me tell you, He's most concerned about your soul. He wants you to be saved and live with Him in heaven. Anyway, so that's our 3 lessons tonight. We must consider our ways. God can use setbacks to get our attention, but also He can make the opposition work in His favor. Anyway, so I hope you got something out of that, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks and study some more from Ezra. Thank you for coming here tonight. I appreciate you coming out on a cold, kind of dreary night.